July 10, 1942, Wideawake Field, Ascension Island. A consolidated B-24 Liberator named Our Kissin' Cousin drops from the afternoon sky toward a runway that shouldn't exist. 6,000 feet of fresh-carved airstrip materialize through the heat shimmer, a geometric impossibility slashed across ancient lava flows. The bomber's wheels kiss volcanic ash mixed with seawater and bird droppings, the only cement substitute available on this barren rock 1,400 miles from the nearest continent. 3 months earlier, military surveyors had declared this place unsuitable for construction. No soil, no stone for concrete, no fresh water, just jagged volcanic debris rising from the South Atlantic, its only inhabitants a screaming colony of sooty terns and a handful of British cable station workers. Yet, as Our Kissin' Cousin's crew disembarks, they're standing on what will become the busiest airport on Earth, a secret weapon that would funnel over 25,000 Allied aircraft to war. Combat engineers had built this runway in exactly 91 days using 13,000 blasting caps and 35 tons of explosives, working under camouflaged lighting to hide from German U-boats. They mixed volcanic ash with seawater and guano, bird droppings accumulated over centuries, to create makeshift cement. The result? A 6,000-foot runway on an island experts had deemed unbuildable. Its location, precisely halfway between Brazil and Africa, solved a crisis bleeding the Allied war effort white. In early 1942, German U-boats ruled a vast ocean area beyond aircraft reach, a killing zone submariners called the gravy ground and Allied sailors knew as the Black Pit. Germany was sinking merchant vessels faster than America could build them, and short-range bombers couldn't cross the Atlantic without modifications taking weeks. Ascension Island changed everything. This volcanic speck became the linchpin of a 10,000-mile air bridge from Florida to Egypt. Twin-engine aircraft could now hop Brazil, Ascension, Africa in manageable jumps. 4-engine bombers refueled mid-journey with full payloads. Patrol aircraft hunted U-boats across former German sanctuaries. The evidence was undeniable. Decades of doubt erased in an instant. Want to know what this meant? Please hit that like button and subscribe. We're bringing you the stories history tried to forget. Here's what happened next. The story of how American engineers built a runway from bird droppings on a waterless volcanic rock is the story of how logistics won the Atlantic War, why military strategists would call Wideawake Field the single most important airfield in the Atlantic theater. By January 1942, German U-boats had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. In 6 months after Pearl Harbor, submarines sank 681 Allied merchant ships, 3.5 million tons sent to the bottom. America was losing ships 4 times faster than shipyards could replace them. The mid-Atlantic air gap stretched 600 miles where convoys sailed without air cover for days. U-boat wolf packs converged with devastating effectiveness. In October 1942 alone, submarines sank 56 ships totaling 258,000 tons. German submariners called these hunting grounds Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. The crisis extended beyond convoy protection. Getting aircraft across the Atlantic proved nearly impossible. The northern ferry route through Newfoundland, Greenland, and Iceland worked for long-range bombers, but winter weather shut it down for months with loss rates approaching 10%. The South Atlantic offered better weather but worse geography. From Florida, aircraft island-hopped to Natal, Brazil. From there, they faced an impossible choice: fly 1,900 miles directly to Africa, beyond twin-engine range without modifications, or wait weeks for fuel tank installations, creating massive bottlenecks. The solution? Ascension Island, sitting 1,437 miles from Natal and 1,357 miles from Accra on Africa's Gold Coast. With an airfield there, twin-engine bombers could make the crossing in 2 comfortable jumps. 4-engine transports could refuel mid-journey, dramatically increasing payload capacity. But Ascension itself seemed designed to thwart construction. Roughly 7 miles long and 6 miles wide, the island was essentially an exposed volcanic peak jutting from the mid-Atlantic ridge. Its 34 square miles consisted of volcanic clinker, jagged porous rock, no trees, no rivers, no fresh water. The interior featured volcanic cinder cones rising to 2,817 feet, creating a landscape one naturalist described as the slag heaps of creation. The island's only inhabitants, a British cable station with perhaps 24 workers, a high-frequency direction-finding station with 5 operators and a 30-man Royal Navy detachment, and a small Royal Artillery garrison with 2 5.5-inch naval guns salvaged from HMS Hood. These forces existed to prevent German use of the island, not to support construction. Initial surveys confirmed the impossibility. No sand for concrete, no aggregate stone, no timber, no fresh water except distilled seawater. Supply ships would carry everything across 1,400 miles of U-boat-infested ocean with no harbor. Materials would be lightered through 8-foot surf. Yet the strategic imperative overrode every objection. Rommel's Africa Corps was advancing toward Cairo. Britain needed aircraft and reinforcements, thousands of tons monthly, and the South Atlantic ferry route was the only reliable way. If Ascension remained impassable, the air bridge would remain severely limited. In February 1942, the decision was made. The 38th Combat Engineer Battalion would build an airfield despite the impossibilities. These 1,500 men from Fort Jackson, South Carolina had trained for conventional missions. None had experience with volcanic islands. None had worked 1,400 miles from supply bases. On March 14th, the battalion departed aboard transports escorted by destroyers Ellis and Greer, plus cruiser Cincinnati. The convoy carried 75 tons of dynamite, heavy equipment, and enough explosives to level a small mountain. The convoy anchored off Ascension March 30. What they saw confirmed their fears. No harbor, no pier, just volcanic cliffs rising from surf and endless wasteland. They spent 27 days unloading 8,000 tons of equipment through the surf, fighting waves to get bulldozers and explosives ashore. The deadline, June 28, 1942, exactly 91 days from construction start. After that, aircraft were scheduled to arrive whether ready or not. Time was already running out. Construction began in April 1942 with a brutal mission: carve a 6,000-foot runway from volcanic bedrock where conventional materials didn't exist. Every solution required improvisation. Every material substitution carried risk. Every day's delay meant more ships sinking. The location was Waterloo Plain, the flattest area on Ascension, though flat meant jagged lava rocks from baseball size to multi-ton boulders. Before grading could begin, engineers had to blast away volcanic debris. Work proceeded 24 hours daily. Day shifts labored under 90-degree heat with crushing humidity. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion regularly. Night shifts operated under camouflaged lighting to prevent U-boat detection. The threat was real. On December 9, 1941, German submarine U-124 had surfaced and attempted to shell Georgetown before coastal artillery drove it away. Engineers used 13,000 blasting caps and 35 tons of explosives to remove 380,000 cubic yards of rock. Bulldozers pushed debris to the sides, creating berms for aircraft revetments and drainage. The noise echoed daily, punctuated by heavy equipment grinding across volcanic wasteland. But removing rock was only the first challenge. Creating a stable runway surface required materials Ascension didn't possess. Conventional airfields used Portland cement, sand, and crushed stone. Supply ships couldn't carry the tonnage required without consuming space for critical supplies. The solution came from the island's abundant resources. Volcanic ash covered much of Ascension's surface. The massive colony of sooty terns had deposited guano across wide areas, in some places several feet deep. Engineers discovered that mixing volcanic ash with seawater and guano created a cement-like substance that hardened into a serviceable surface. The chemistry was far from ideal. Guano's nitrogen could cause unpredictable reactions. Seawater's salt would corrode metal, but it worked, and it was free, abundant, and available immediately. Construction became a blend of modern engineering and primitive improvisation. American bulldozers and graders worked alongside mixing techniques from ancient Rome. The guano-ash-seawater mixture was spread, grated smooth, and cured in tropical heat. Compaction created a surprisingly hard surface capable of supporting multi-ton bombers. The runway measured 6,000 feet long and 150 feet wide, dimensions calculated to accommodate B-25 Mitchells, B-26 Marauders, C-47 Skytrains, and 4 engine bombers. It would require constant maintenance, but it was buildable within 91 days. Supporting facilities rose simultaneously: control tower, operations buildings, maintenance hangars, 2 420,000-gallon fuel tanks. A floating pipeline at Catherine Point, 3 miles away, would pump fuel from offshore tankers. Medical facilities, radar stations, and a command complex were established. Fresh water remained critical. Every drop had to be distilled from seawater, limiting personnel numbers. Water rationing was strict, just enough for drinking, basic hygiene, and cooking. Engineers worked through tropical downpours, volcanic dust storms, and unrelenting heat. The dust infiltrated everything: equipment, food, lungs. But the 91-day deadline allowed no slack. On June 15, 1942, 2 weeks before deadline, 2 British Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers made an unexpected landing on the unfinished runway. Flying from escort carrier HMS Archer, the pilots spotted Ascension and landed. Nervous American gunners fired warning shots before recognizing them as Allied. The incident proved the runway was functional ahead of schedule. On July 7, 1942, exactly 91 days after construction began, Wideawake Field officially opened. 3 days later, B-24 Liberator, our kissing cousin, arrived from Accra, bound for Natal. The bomber touched down, refueled, and departed safely. The South Atlantic ferry route was open. By July's end, 126 aircraft had landed at Wideawake Field. The impossible had become routine. Wideawake Field's opening triggered immediate transformation. Within weeks, it became the most critical node in a global network, from American factories to battlefields. The impact was measurable, immediate, and decisive. July 1942, 126 aircraft. August, over 200. By September, the South Atlantic ferry route was processing more aircraft than the northern route through Iceland. Aircraft that had required weeks of modifications or dangerous overwater flights could now hop Brazil Ascension Africa in 2 comfortable stages. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber exemplified the transformation. With 1,350-mile range, Mitchells couldn't make the 1,900-mile Natal to Africa flight without expensive fuel tank modifications, taking weeks and adding significant weight. With Ascension, fly 1,437 miles to Ascension, refuel in hours, then 1,357 miles to Accra with fuel to spare. What had been impossible became routine. What had been a bottleneck became an assembly line. The route worked like a precisely calibrated production system. Aircraft departed Morrison Field in Florida, hopped through the Caribbean to Trinidad, then down Brazil's coast to Belém and Natal. From Natal, they crossed to Ascension, refueled, and continued to Africa, either to Accra in the Gold Coast, Roberts Field in Liberia, or Hastings Field in Sierra Leone. From these West African bases, aircraft flew across the Trans-Sahara route to Cairo or north to Allied forces in Algeria and Tunisia. The entire system depended on Ascension functioning as the critical pivot point. In July 1942, 57 B-25s of the 12th Bombardment Group departed Morrison Field for Egypt. Using Wideawake as their waypoint, all arrived safely after 10,000 miles in 72 hours average flying time. Their ground echelons, shipped by sea, took a month. The contrast demonstrated air power's strategic advantage when logistics worked. 4 engine bombers gained different but equally significant advantages. B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses could make the direct Natal Africa flight, but needed maximum fuel, meaning reduced cargo. With Ascension, they departed with moderate fuel and full cargo, topped off tanks, then continued with maximum supplies. The increased effective payload capacity meant more spare parts, more ammunition, more supplies reaching combat theaters per aircraft. C-47 Skytrains perhaps benefited most dramatically. These workhorses of military aviation had 1,600-mile ranges, making the direct crossing marginal. With Ascension splitting the journey, C-47s ferried troops, supplies, and high-priority cargo with comfortable margins. The psychological impact was significant. Instead of one white-knuckle overwater flight wondering if fuel would last, pilots faced 2 routine flights with a solid runway halfway across. Fighter aircraft presented unique challenges. P-38 Lightnings, with their twin-engine configuration, could make the Brazil Ascension Africa crossing, but required careful fuel management. P-51 Mustangs, arriving later in the war, used the route to reach Mediterranean and European theaters. Each fighter that successfully transited Wideawake represented not just one more aircraft in theater, but one more pilot who didn't have to risk the dangerous northern route or wait weeks for ship transport. Anti-submarine benefits extended operations dramatically. By August 1942, patrol aircraft hunted U-boats across thousands of square miles that had been German sanctuaries. PBY Catalinas and modified B-24s reached ocean areas land-based aircraft from Brazil or Africa couldn't cover. U-boats that had prowled freely now faced air patrols far from any coastline. A pilot's saying captured the stakes: "If we don't hit Ascension, my wife gets a pension." The airfield sat barely visible until overhead, a pinpoint in millions of square miles. Navigation errors could be fatal. Miss Ascension by 100 miles, and pilots faced an expanding circle of ocean with dwindling fuel. Yet pilots developed techniques aided by radio beacons and increasingly sophisticated navigation aids, and fail rates remained remarkably low. Peak came in mid-1943 when Allied forces fought in North Africa and prepared for Sicily. During this peak, Wideawake received approximately 1,000 aircraft monthly. The record? January 25, 1944, 98 aircraft in one day, many bound for Anzio, where Allied forces had just established a beachhead requiring immediate air support. For 24 hours, Wideawake was literally the busiest airport on Earth, traffic volume exceeding New York's LaGuardia or London's Croydon. The garrison expanded to 4,000 American servicemen by mid-1943. The 38th Combat Engineer Battalion had departed for projects in the Belgian Congo, replaced by the 91st Infantry Regiment under Colonel Ross O. Baldwin, the 998th Engineer Aviation Company, and support units. The tiny British possession now hosted more Americans than British subjects. Infrastructure continued expanding. The runway grew from 6,000 to 6,700 feet in late 1942, providing additional safety margins for heavy bombers. Additional fuel storage appeared, 2 massive 420,000-gallon tanks supporting enormous consumption. More maintenance facilities were constructed. A daily news sheet began publication on August 21, 1942, originally titled the 877 News after the Army Post Office number, eventually becoming Task, lasting through war's end. Living conditions remained austere, water rationing never eased. Each serviceman received just enough for drinking, basic hygiene, and cooking. Volcanic dust infiltrated everything. Temperatures exceeded 90 degrees. Isolation was profound. 700 miles from nearest land. Mail took weeks. Recreational facilities were minimal. Yet morale remained surprisingly high, sustained by knowledge that every aircraft represented one more bomber reaching the fight, one more step toward victory. The U.S. Navy established an anti-submarine squadron in September 1943, flying PB-4Y-1 Liberators modified for maritime patrol. Operating with the HF-DF station monitoring German naval radio transmissions, these patrol aircraft achieved remarkable success. German U-boats maneuvering in the South Atlantic found themselves hunted by aircraft operating from a base most submariners didn't know existed. Several U-boats were located through radio intercepts processed through Ascension's HF-DF station and relayed to patrol aircraft. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was significant. Nowhere in the Atlantic seemed safe anymore. The strategic impact rippled outward. Rommel's Africa Corps, advancing toward Cairo in summer 1942, suddenly faced Allied reinforcements arriving faster than German intelligence predicted. The tide turned at El Alamein in October 1942, with British and Commonwealth forces stopping Rommel's advance. American aircraft arriving via Wideawake played a crucial role in providing air superiority. Operation Torch, November 1942 Allied landings in North Africa, succeeded partly because aircraft could be concentrated in theater faster than Axis forces could respond. By late 1943, the strategic situation had transformed. The mid-Atlantic gap had been closed by long-range B-24s from Britain, Iceland, Greenland, and the Azores. U-boat losses became unsustainable. The South Atlantic ferry route via Wideawake had delivered thousands of aircraft to combat zones. The base that shouldn't have been possible had fundamentally altered the Atlantic War's logistics. Yet the cost remained high. More than 60 men died serving on or around Ascension, most in aircraft accidents, others from tropical diseases and equipment accidents. The worst, May 10, 1945, 3 days after VE Day, a C-47 made a premature landing, exploded on impact, killing 12 of 18 aboard. The American cemetery at Two Boats eventually held 36 graves before repatriation in February 1947. But measured against contribution, Wideawake's record was extraordinary. Over 25,000 aircraft transited during peak operations from mid-1942 through 1944. They carried fighters, bombers, transports to theaters across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. They delivered ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, reinforcements. They provided air superiority, enabling ground operations. And they did so because combat engineers had built a runway where experts said it couldn't be done. Why did Wideawake Field seem impossible? The requirements were clear: build a 6,000-foot runway for multi-ton bombers. The constraints equally clear: 1,400 miles from supply bases, no construction materials, no fresh water, under U-boat threat. The geography imposed brutal constraints. Ascension's volcanic clinker, porous, jagged rock, lacked structural integrity. It couldn't be cut like granite or crushed into concrete aggregate. Its porosity absorbed water, creating drainage problems. The location added logistical nightmares. No natural harbor. The volcanic island dropped steeply into deep water. Every ton had to be lightered through 8-foot surf. Supply ships anchored in open ocean, vulnerable to weather and submarines. The climate, temperatures exceeding 90 degrees, high humidity, tropical downpours alternating with dust storms. Any equipment failure would take weeks to repair. The water shortage proved most limiting. Ascension had no natural fresh water. Every drop had to be distilled from seawater using fuel. This limited personnel and made large-scale concrete construction seemingly impossible. Conventional construction would need thousands of tons of Portland cement across U-boat waters, plus crushed stone, steel, lumber, mixing water. Timeline and tonnage appeared prohibitive, yet strategic necessity overrode pessimism. U-boats were sinking ships faster than replacement. Twin-engine aircraft couldn't cross directly without modifications, creating bottlenecks. The imperative: build on Ascension or accept a severely limited air bridge. The engineering solution came from necessity. The battalion's leaders examined available resources: volcanic ash, seawater, bird droppings. Could these substitute for cement? Volcanic ash contained silicates, potentially creating cement-like compounds. Seawater was unlimited, though salt would corrode metal. Guano deposits contained nitrogen and phosphates, acting as binding agents. The chemistry was far from ideal, nothing like Portland cement's precise ratios heated to 2,700 degrees. But the volcanic ash, seawater, guano mixture could be spread, graded, and cured. Under compaction, it hardened enough to support bombers temporarily. The decision involved accepting trade-offs: weaker surface requiring constant maintenance, salt corroding metal, organic compounds decomposing, creating voids, faster erosion, quicker tire wear. But waiting for conventional cement would delay opening by months. The ferry route would remain closed. The North African window might close. Against these strategic costs, accepting high maintenance seemed reasonable. The solution represented a fundamental principle: perfect is the enemy of good enough. A concrete runway to commercial standards would be ideal, but building such a runway on Ascension in 1942 was impossible given time, resources, and threats. The volcanic ash runway was far from ideal, but it was buildable in 91 days, making it superior to the perfect runway that didn't exist. Similar trade-offs governed construction. Fuel tanks were positioned 3 miles away because that offered the only practical offshore tanker access. Fuel had to be trucked across rough terrain, time-consuming and inefficient, but building a new harbor would have taken years. The decision to work 24 hours under camouflaged lighting reflected similar calculations. Daylight would be faster and safer, but U-boats could observe construction and report to Berlin. The longer Germany remained unaware, the longer U-boats operated without accounting for aircraft from Ascension. The 91-day deadline itself represented a gamble. Civilian construction would take 6 months to a year, but aircraft were already scheduled. Either the runway would be ready or the strategic plan would unravel. The philosophy would later be codified: build what's needed, when needed, using whatever's available. Perfection can wait, functionality cannot. This principle, proved on Ascension's volcanic clinker, would guide American military construction throughout Pacific campaigns, Europe after D-Day, and every subsequent conflict requiring engineers to build under combat conditions with limited resources. The runway that seemed impossible to build proved equally challenging to maintain, yet Wideawake operated continuously from July 1942 through war's end, processing thousands of aircraft through a fundamentally improvised facility. The volcanic ash seawater guano surface suffered exactly predicted stresses. Heavy bombers landing on the surface gradually compressed the material, creating depressions pooling water during downpours. The pooled water then eroded surrounding surface, expanding the depressions into genuine hazards. Maintenance crews worked continuously, filling holes, resurfacing worn sections, and patching areas where the improvised concrete had simply failed. Aircraft tires abraded the surface far faster than conventional concrete would have worn. Each landing and takeoff scraped away microscopic amounts of the volcanic ash mixture. Multiply by dozens of aircraft daily, and the wear became significant. Sections of runway near the touchdown zones required resurfacing every few months. The maintenance schedule became a race between wear and repair, with engineers perpetually trying to stay ahead of deterioration. Salt corroded metal components immediately. Any metal in direct contact with the runway surface began corroding almost immediately. Reinforcing bars rusted, drainage grates pitted and weakened. Metal fixtures embedded in the runway deteriorated faster than their design life predicted. Engineers learned to minimize metal contact with the runway surface and to expect shorter service lives for components that couldn't be isolated. Tropical rains proved more devastating than anticipated. Ascension's rainfall is intermittent but intense. When tropical systems passed overhead, inches of rain could fall in hours. The volcanic ash mixture, more porous than conventional concrete, absorbed water like a sponge. Saturated sections of runway softened, creating dangerous conditions for landing aircraft. After major rain events, the airfield often had to close temporarily until the runway surface dried sufficiently to support operations. These closures, while necessary for safety, created backlogs of aircraft waiting to transit. The dust presented different challenges. During dry periods, constant trade winds whipped volcanic dust across the island, creating clouds that reduced visibility and infiltrated everything. Aircraft engines required more frequent maintenance. Pilots complained about dust obscuring the runway during approach. Ground crews worked with handkerchiefs over their faces. The dust got into food, water supplies, equipment, and bunks. No amount of sealing could keep it out. Personnel simply learned to live with perpetual grit in everything they touched. Aircraft accidents proved inevitable. Navigation to Ascension required precision. The island was a pinpoint in millions of square miles. Radio navigation aids helped, but equipment failures, navigation errors, or simple bad weather could send aircraft off course. Pilots who missed Ascension faced increasingly desperate fuel situations. Some made it to alternative fields in Brazil or Africa, others didn't. The ocean around Ascension holds the wreckage of aircraft and the remains of crews who nearly made it. Landing at Wideawake required skills beyond normal pilot training. The runway's volcanic ash surface provided less friction than conventional concrete, meaning braking distances were longer. Pilots had to touch down precisely in the first 1,000 feet of runway to leave enough distance for stopping. Overshot aircraft faced volcanic rocks at the runway's end, sharp debris capable of shredding tires, damaging undercarriages, or worse. Several aircraft sustained damage from overruns. Others crashed into the rocks, sometimes with fatal results. The colony of sooty terns for which Wideawake Field was named created operational hazards. These seabirds numbered in the hundreds of thousands, their massive colony occupying areas near the runway. During breeding season, the terns became aggressive, dive-bombing anyone who approached their nesting grounds. More critically, birds in flight posed collision risks. A sooty tern sucked into an aircraft engine could cause catastrophic failure. Bird strikes broke windscreens. On several occasions, the airfield had to temporarily shut down during peak bird activity to prevent accidents. October 1943 demonstrated how multiple factors could combine tragically. 3 separate crashes occurred around Ascension that month, killing 16 men. The accidents stemmed from different causes: navigation error, mechanical failure, and pilot error, but all reflected the inherent risks of operating a high-tempo military airfield in a remote, challenging environment. The bodies recovered at sea were buried in the American Cemetery at 2 Boats, a location that would eventually hold 36 graves before bodies were repatriated after the war. Weather presented unpredictable hazards. Tropical systems could develop rapidly, transforming clear skies into violent thunderstorms within hours. Aircraft caught between weather systems sometimes had no alternative but to attempt landing at Wideawake in conditions that would have grounded operations at safer airfields. Crosswinds made landing on the relatively narrow runway even more challenging. Reduced visibility from rain or dust turned precision approaches into desperate searches for the runway threshold. Fuel logistics remained perpetually challenging. The offshore fuel transfer system worked but required careful coordination. Tanker ships had to anchor in deep water, vulnerable to weather and submarine attack. The floating pipeline at Catherine Point could only operate in relatively calm seas. Fuel transfer operations shut down entirely when swells exceeded safe limits. Once fuel reached the storage tanks at Georgetown, it had to be transported by Bowser trucks to the airfield, a 3-mile journey across rough volcanic terrain that limited throughput and created potential bottlenecks. The isolation took psychological tolls. Personnel stationed on Ascension were 700 miles from the nearest inhabited land. Mail took weeks. News from home arrived irregularly. The island offered virtually no recreational facilities. The volcanic landscape provided little beauty or variety. The heat, humidity, and dust were unrelenting. Men counted days until rotation stateside. The daily news sheet, Task, provided one of the few diversions, bringing news from the outside world and occasional humor to men who desperately needed both. Yet operations continued. Through accidents, weather, maintenance crises, and isolation, Wideawake Field processed aircraft at rates that would have impressed commercial airports in peacetime. The peak month saw approximately 1,000 aircraft transit the facility. The record day, January 25, 1944, saw 98 aircraft movements, making Wideawake temporarily the busiest airport on Earth. Many of these aircraft were headed for Anzio, Italy, where Allied forces had just established a beachhead requiring immediate air support. The anti-submarine operations from Wideawake proved particularly effective. Navy PB-4Y-1 Liberators, operating in conjunction with the HFDF station monitoring German naval radio traffic, hunted U-boats across vast areas of the South Atlantic. German submariners, accustomed to treating the South Atlantic as relatively safe hunting grounds, suddenly found themselves targeted by aircraft they didn't know existed. Several U-boats were located through radio intercepts, then attacked by liberators launched from Ascension. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was significant. Nowhere in the Atlantic seemed safe anymore. The cost of these successes was measured in constant effort. Maintenance crews worked around the clock keeping the runway operational. Engineers perpetually patched, resurfaced, and reinforced the failing volcanic ash mixture. Supply personnel managed the complex logistics of keeping 4,000 men fed, equipped, and functioning 1,400 miles from supply bases. Medical staff treated the endless stream of heat exhaustion, tropical diseases, and injuries. Everyone worked 6 or 7 days a week because the mission allowed no time off. By mid-1944, as Allied forces advanced across Europe and the strategic focus shifted, Wideawake Field's tempo began declining. The peak had passed. Aircraft still transited through Ascension, but in smaller numbers as alternate routes became available and strategic priorities shifted. The garrison began drawing down. Units departed for other theaters. The fevered pace of 1943 slowed to something approaching routine. Yet even in decline, Wideawake Field remained operationally critical. The South Atlantic air bridge it anchored continued functioning through war's end. Aircraft still needed the mid-ocean refueling stop. The anti-submarine patrols continued hunting the last U-boats still prowling the Atlantic. The impossible airfield, built in 91 days on a volcanic rock, continued doing the job it was built to do until victory made it unnecessary. From July 1942 through 1944, over 25,000 Allied aircraft transited Wideawake Field. Fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance planes, and patrol aircraft moving from American factories to combat theaters in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. These weren't routine flights, they were military operations moving war materiel to battlefronts where every aircraft, every ton of supplies, every replacement pilot could affect strategic outcomes. The breakdown of aircraft types reveals the diversity of the South Atlantic ferry route. B-25 Mitchell medium bombers formed a substantial portion. These versatile aircraft proved crucial in North African operations, providing tactical bombing support for ground forces. B-26 Marauders, faster but more challenging to fly, also used the route in significant numbers. C-47 Skytrain transports, the workhorses of military aviation, ferried troops and supplies across the Atlantic by the hundreds. 4-engine B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, capable of direct Atlantic crossings but benefiting from Ascension's refueling facilities, passed through regularly. Fighter aircraft, including P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, made the journey as American air forces built up in European and Mediterranean theaters. Peak operational period came in 1943 and early 1944, when Wideawake Field was processing approximately 1,000 aircraft per month. This represented roughly one aircraft every 45 minutes during peak operational hours, a tempo comparable to busy commercial airports in peacetime. The record day of January 25, 1944, saw 98 aircraft movements in 24 hours, placing Wideawake Field among the world's busiest airports for that brief period. Garrison strength peaked at approximately 4,000 American servicemen in mid-1943, plus several hundred British personnel manning cable and wireless facilities and various support functions. These 4,000 men operated an airfield processing more traffic than many pre-war commercial airports on an island with no natural resources, 1,400 miles from supply bases under constant maintenance challenges. The personnel density was remarkable, roughly 120 men per square mile of island, all concentrated around the airfield and support facilities. Infrastructure expanded continuously throughout the war. The runway received an extension from 6,000 feet to 6,700 feet between November 1942 and February 1943, providing additional safety margins for heavy bombers. Two massive fuel tanks, each holding 420,000 gallons, were installed to support the enormous fuel consumption of transiting aircraft. The floating pipeline at Catherine Point, connecting offshore tankers to the tank farm at Georgetown, pumped millions of gallons of aviation fuel during the war. Additional storage facilities, maintenance hangars, operations buildings, and personnel accommodations appeared as the garrison expanded. The anti-submarine operations yielded impressive results. While exact numbers remain difficult to verify from surviving records, German U-boats operating in the South Atlantic faced dramatically increased risks after Wideawake's anti-submarine patrols began. Multiple U-boats were sunk by aircraft operating from Ascension, and the psychological impact on German submariners was significant. The South Atlantic, previously considered relatively safe for U-boat operations, became another killing ground where Allied air power could reach. The cost in American lives totaled at least 60 men killed during the war years, with 36 buried in the American cemetery at 2 boats before repatriation in 1947. These deaths stemmed primarily from aircraft accidents, crashes on approach or departure, navigation errors, mechanical failures, but also included casualties from vehicle accidents, equipment failures, and tropical diseases. The volcanic dust, unrelenting heat, and isolated conditions made Ascension a hardship post where normal accidents carried higher consequences than similar incidents in less remote locations. Comparing Wideawake Field to contemporary facilities illuminates its unique characteristics. Major American airfields like Morrison Field in Florida or LaGuardia in New York had concrete runways, extensive facilities, ample fresh water, and proximity to supply infrastructure. Wideawake had a runway made from volcanic ash and bird droppings, chronic water shortages, and supply lines stretching 1,400 miles across submarine-infested waters. Yet Wideawake processed comparable traffic volumes during peak periods, operated continuously through conditions that would have closed civilian airports, and achieved accident rates comparable to much better equipped facilities. The British assessment of Wideawake's importance came in various official communications. Colonel Mullenix, U.S. cavalry commander of the station for much of the war, wrote to Cable and Wireless, "Ascension Island has played a unique and vital part in the war. Without the existence of Ascension, without its active facilitation of the movement of our aeroplanes, the indispensable aviation support for our troops in North Africa could not have been provided in time." British military planners echoed this assessment, noting that Rommel's defeat at El Alamein depended partly on aircraft arriving via the South Atlantic route. The airfield's operational life extended beyond VE Day. While traffic declined significantly after Germany's surrender in May 1945, Wideawake continued operations through VJ Day in August and into the post-war period. The garrison drew down gradually. By June 1945, only 450 men remained from the 4,000 stationed at peak. The daily news sheet, Task, ceased publication in September 1945. The American military began dismantling facilities and preparing for departure by late 1945. Final American withdrawal came in phases through 1946, with the last significant contingent departing by mid-year. The British resumed control of the island, maintaining minimal facilities. The airfield fell into disuse after the war, the volcanic ash runway gradually deteriorating without constant maintenance. The island returned to its pre-war isolation, home again to just the cable and wireless station staff and the millions of sooty turns. But Ascension's strategic value would be rediscovered. The Americans returned in 1956 as the space race began, reopening Wideawake Airfield as a tracking station for missile tests and satellite operations. The runway was rebuilt and extended in the 1960s to 10,000 feet, eventually becoming an emergency landing site for the Space Shuttle program. In 1982, Wideawake played a crucial role in Britain's Falklands War campaign, serving as the primary staging base for Operation Corporate. For several weeks in 1982, Wideawake briefly reclaimed its World War II distinction as one of the busiest airports on Earth. The volcanic ash runway that shouldn't have been possible to build in 1942 was replaced by modern concrete in the 1960s. The improvised facilities that supported 4,000 men were rebuilt to permanent standards. The impossible became routine, then historical, then rediscovered as still strategically relevant. The tiny volcanic island that military surveyors had dismissed as unsuitable for construction has hosted military operations across 8 decades of conflict and competition. The accounting of Wideawake Field's World War II service shows clear strategic value. Over 25,000 aircraft transited. The South Atlantic Air Bridge functioned continuously for 3 years. North African operations received critical air support, and U-boat operations in the South Atlantic faced deadly new risks. But the deeper accounting, the principle that strategic necessity can overcome technical limitations, that engineers can build what seems impossible when failure isn't acceptable, that logistics determine strategy as much as strategy determines logistics, those lessons proved more valuable than any single operational achievement. The examination of Wideawake Field from today's perspective reveals how completely this story has vanished from popular history. Ask people to name important Allied airfields. They'll mention Iwo Jima, British bomber bases, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Almost none will mention Wideawake. Yet by aircraft processed and strategic impact, few airfields matched its importance. The obscurity is understandable. Wideawake wasn't a combat airfield. No dramatic battles were fought over it. It existed in the logistical shadow, unglamorous infrastructure generating no newsreel footage. Yet combat depended absolutely on logistics. Wideawake provided the bridge, making North African and Mediterranean operations possible at required scale and tempo. The contrast reflects a broader truth. Logistics win wars, but glory goes to combat. The combat engineer who spent 91 days blasting volcanic rock accomplished more than many celebrated aces, yet no one remembers his name. The entire 4,000-man garrison vanished into historical anonymity. Yet Wideawake represented something profound about American military capability. When confronted with a requirement that seemed impossible, American engineers found a way. They didn't wait for ideal conditions or insist on proper materials. They examined available resources, volcanic ash, seawater, bird droppings, and improvised a solution that worked. That pragmatic adaptability characterized American military operations throughout the war. The contrast with Axis engineering philosophy was telling. German and Japanese military engineering often prioritized technical perfection over operational necessity, achieving remarkable sophistication but frequently unable to adapt when ideal conditions didn't exist. American engineers mixed volcanic ash with bird droppings and got aircraft operational in 91 days. This approach proved decisive across theaters. The same philosophy that built Wideawake Field in 91 days sustained armies across continents and navies across oceans. The techniques developed, using local materials, accepting maintenance costs for speed, prioritizing operational capability over perfection, became doctrine for American military engineering in every subsequent conflict. The final irony, Wideawake Field's most important contribution, proving strategic requirements can override technical limitations, is precisely what makes it historically invisible. Because the airfield worked, because aircraft got through, operations proceeded as planned. The strategic impact was enormous but invisible. Victory enabled rather than achieved. It simply worked, allowing everything else to work, which is logistics at its most effective and least celebrated. The monument to Wideawake Field is the absence of a monument. It's the 25,000 aircraft that crossed the Atlantic through this volcanic waypoint while pilots barely remembered the island. It's El Alamein, made possible by aircraft that refueled on a runway made from bird droppings. The monument is every operation that succeeded because logistics functioned. Wideawake Field, the impossible volcanic airfield built in 91 days from materials that shouldn't work, processed more military aircraft than most major airports and enabled strategic victories across 2 continents. Then it was forgotten, perhaps the highest compliment to its effectiveness. When strategic requirements seem to exceed technical capabilities, remember the combat engineers who built a runway from volcanic ash and bird droppings, because the alternative was failure. Remember that impossible often means difficult when failure isn't acceptable. Remember that logistics win wars, even when no one remembers the logistics. The volcanic rock in the South Atlantic proved that geography matters, that engineering ingenuity can overcome material limitations, and that sometimes the most important victories happen in places no one remembers. 25,000 aircraft carried that lesson to war.